Um, Useful and reassuring. I think it did a lot for those of us that are interested in this space and the large social issue that it represents. To hear their cautious optimism, I guess, is how I'd frame that. Um, Look, I think the thesis that the panelists at least had that I think was reassuring was that they agree that there's potential benefit for psychedelic-assisted therapy and treatment in a medical setting, right? For those individuals struggling with these complex mental health challenges like PTSD, comorbid, SUDS, depression, debilitating anxiety, these massive problems with massive numbers. They agree that this shows great potential in a medical setting. I think below that, they hit 4 points. Various members of the panel hit 4 points that I think, again, were just reassuring confirmation of what we assumed was between the lines and behind the scenes of the recent Fed denial for MDMA descheduling coming out of the Lycos MDMA clinical trial. And that was, they acknowledged that the need is massive, right? I mean, we heard some pretty daunting numbers, 6 million vets a year needing mental health care at the VA system alone, 14% of veterans with PTSD diagnosed. And that's just a small subset of the population. And the numbers don't get smaller when you expand out. And it was good that they're acknowledging the pain of the constituents that they're serving, because that's how we get these agencies to mobilize, and that's how we get them to support the safe implementation of solutions in the broader market. And so that was, I think, for a lot of folks who are trying to find these solutions and enter this new vertical, I think they found that reassuring. Again, the idea that these are anything other than dramatically complex mental health issues, I think is irrationally exuberant. I think they were definitely confirming that they acknowledge that what they have seen, what we have seen, what those data are that are available around the efficacy of this treatment, that it defies a simple solution. It is complex enough that simple solutions won't address across broad populations what needs to be addressed. I think I was particularly reassured to hear the call for the need for improvements of treatment and access to treatment, as opposed to coming up with new pseudo-clinical models of care out of thin air. And I think they were very polite about it, but I think they were nodding to a discomfort around the dispensary model, the non-clinical model that seems to be propagating throughout from Oregon east. And again, I think that's something we should be reassured by, because to come up with new models of care that aren't scientifically based or loosely based on scientific methodology is risky when trying to apply it to broad populations. Evolution, not revolution, I guess, right? And the other thing that pretty much everyone said, both panel and public commentators and respondents as well, was that there's need for more data, right? That those data that we have are meaningful and critical, but the N is small, right? Those the data sets are minuscule and very narrow in who it's treating and how it's treating it. And there has to be more work done. There has to be more meaningful, structured data that can be analyzed in order to come up with refined, precise protocols of multidisciplinary care leveraging as one of the modalities, one of the arrows of the quiver from a pharmacotherapy standpoint, psychedelics as it relates to these mental health disorders. So again, I particularly appreciated their nod to that, acknowledgement that the work is not done yet. And I think, between the lines, what we heard and what we took away from the ruling last month to not deschedule from a Schedule 1 to a lesser Schedule 2 through 5 for MDMA in particular, or the adjacent synthetic molecule that was part of the trial. We heard that there's, the need for more trials, the support for more trials. I mean, we heard the VA is supporting 12 trials currently, which was interesting to hear. I didn't know there were that many that were spinning up, phase 1 trials. But that's not surprising, right? And hitting different components of these diagnoses, hitting different constituent populations, and leveraging a different and hopefully more medical approach, right? A bona fide medical approach that isn't based on, right? They're not looking through an emotional lens, is sort of how I would read it. And I think their concern was that the models of care out there were operating off of sympathetic voodoo magic, idiosyncratic experiences of one individual, trying to extrapolate that to a broader audience, non-clinical staff members sitting in situ with patients for long periods of time in isolation. There was a couple mentions of that, which again, that's where the model strays from a truly clinical or medical model, is when you don't engage licensed clinicians. Like when you have someone in the room who is not a clinician, who isn't trained in patient safe boundaries, in ethics of clinical care, in the basics of care planning and aftercare management. It produces an unnecessary amount of risk for the patients. At least in these early goings, when we have a directional indication of benefit of these things in concert with other modalities of care, but we don't have the precision around that accurate direction yet. And so I think that cautious optimism as a counterbalance, as a countervalence to the irrational exuberance that we see from a lot of other folks out in the market that desperately want a solution, which is understandable, and organizations and institutions that have laudable efforts to find solutions for these big problems, but are doing so through almost an emotional lens, as opposed to a clinical, empirically based lens set. All in all, I thought it was very reassuring that the feds are going slow and methodically to be able to help facilitate a safe use for these new and very powerful drugs, for which there is very little data about long-term effects, about physiological risks. It's a little bit of a how heavy is a rock question, right? It's variable based on the positionality of the ask, right? So I can't answer that as cleanly as you might want, but what I will say is that there's never enough, because the work is never really done, whether or not it's designated as a clinical trial or it's just ongoing accepted safe clinical practice out in the marketplace, where there's the need for meaningful data collection ongoing, the constant adaptation around data collection and machine learning adaptive prevention treatments that come out of data collection of a meaningful nature. I don't think the work is ever really done, right? I don't think it's a pencils down kind of situation. It's reassuring, the sheer number, but what I would say is that when I dig into those numbers, I think the simple answer is no, there's not enough being done around certain categories of psychedelic and certain diagnoses and diseases of constituent patient populations, right? And you see, not surprisingly, the majority of clinical trials, the vast majority of clinical trials, are based on testing the efficacy and toxicity and safety of synthetic molecules, right? And very little is being done of a broad sweeping nature in researching of a clinical trial nature, psilocybin, right? And the couple trials that have spun up have focused on very, very narrow populations, right? The terminally ill cancer patients that struggle with depression, anxiety around pending doom and death. That's not exactly a population that's massive. It's not exactly a use case that you can extrapolate to large populations, like you see with some of the trials coming into the spaces around the synthetic molecules. And again, it's not surprising. There's I heard someone else say there's money in molecules, not in mushrooms, right? And so the pharma bros push effort in the molecule trials because they can presumably eventually make money on molecules they have patents for and can produce. And that is what it is, but that's why there's so many trials that are focused on synthetic and adjacent to publicly free and available molecules, right? MDMA adjacent, which is the Lykos molecule. But yeah, I think that's not surprising. So it's a lot in a very narrow range with small ends, all of them. Again, I think that's interesting to see. These are small patient populations that are part of these trials. And that small N means that we have to do a lot more than 12. And the fact that there's not a lot focused on psilocybin, and yet most of the legalization and decriminalization efforts at a state level are focused on psilocybin, I think there's an incongruity there. I think there's a disconnect around the research and trials of a macro nature at a federal level versus what people are comfortable legalizing and decriminalizing. And that's what we see happening in the states. And that's an interesting dynamic to play out in terms of getting this out into the market before a very staid and conservative federal government and set of subset agencies is willing to accommodate a descheduling or a movement to more free and easy access to these modalities of care. I think the state as incubator of good ideas is being represented very well here in the development of practice as it relates to psychedelic use for folks needing it desperately needing something. And so that, again, I think was unspoken, but very visible in its absence, was this notion of psilocybin, discussion of state regulations as it relates to Schedule 1, as it relates to Fed movement on Schedule 1. And I think that's where a lot of the frustration happens in the marketplace from what I've seen. That irrational exuberance when it encounters a staid and slow and conservative governing body, I think that's frustrating. And I think it's frustrating in part because of what we heard from those people that were calling in, that were responding in the public forums period of the call. It's heart-wrenching. I mean, these are profound and debilitating circumstances that you wouldn't wish on anyone. And so I understand the desire and the desperation for something, because the some things that are out there, they just haven't worked. Whether it's, coming at it from a pharmacotherapy standpoint, SSRIs and others, I've heard someone else describe it as, layering a fog over the mountainside to layering fresh snow and fresh powder on the mountain to get you out of the ruts that you keep going down every single time. The fog may be helpful because you don't see the ruts, but it doesn't change the ruts. And psychedelics offers a chance to hit reset Now, I would argue that, those of us coming at it from a medical model approach would say, that's great to throw fresh snow on the mountainside so that you don't go down the same ruts, but you might go down the same ruts because of historical, behavioral, or social determinant factors. You may just go down the double black diamond because that's what you've only done and always done. And until you involve robust psychotherapy, until you involve other modalities of care that can help you unpack those seemingly ancillary or secondary things, you will be destined to have lesser results, because you will fall back into behaviors and patterns that you have historically. That's just human nature. But again, that's why I think a multidisciplinary approach is something the feds would support at some point down the line, and something that isn't just a dispensary model or a single pharmacotherapy model. Because as with, the complex substance use disorder and addiction space, which is where I have my range of experience coming in at from the SUDS treatment landscape and dual diagnosis patients, PTSD and SUDS. Again, it defies a simple solution. Single pharmacotherapies are necessary but insufficient, right? I mean, I've never seen a single pharmacotherapy clinic that was a clinic, right? That's just not medical, right? I've never seen an Advil clinic. I've never seen a ciprofloxacin clinic. I mean, we talk about the merits and demerits of those all day long, but those aren't medical. And in the same way, I think the feds are saying we've been down this road before. We tried this with buprenorphine. We tried it with methadone. We tried it with other drugs and interventions, and it has not gone well for us historically. So we're gonna be a little more cautious and make sure that we don't simply propagate this single pharmacotherapy bias and insufficiency of care that, frankly, again, the adverse events and toxicity and safety considerations, the numbers are very small in terms of those individuals who have negative experiences physiologically or mentally, and that's reassuring, but it isn't zero. You do not want to take MDMA or adjacent synthetics if you have the congenital heart valve issue that some people have. Very small percentage of the population has. It will have a very suboptimal effect for your heart valve. But you won't know that until you run a genetic test on a patient. And we don't see that being done in any of these cases. You don't see genetic tests being done in any of these environments or trials that focus on identifying how fast the individual metabolizes psychedelics. And it's not just based on weight, right? That's a blunt instrument. You could have a very high metabolism and a very high weight. The dosage is again, that's another area of synthetic voodoo magic that requires more data and more precision, and more effort from more clinical observation and team members. The safe tapering off of SSRIs is another big issue that the feds have seen, especially around the medical tourism landscape, the destination centers for multiple day sessions of dosing, a lot of times with ayahuasca and other drugs. But this notion that they tell you to taper off of SSRIs, but they don't do true medication management. They don't talk to your prescriber. They don't work with the patient to find a safe and effective tapering. They don't do a review of systems to identify from a mental health perspective, are you appropriate for this care? Are the SSRIs really effective? And is it safer for you to stay on the SSRI, right? Those questions aren't being asked. And I think what we heard were the majority of agencies saying, folks. We have to ask those questions. We have to have a medical model. We can't just have another dispensary model. This is a different drug. This is a mind-altering, hallucinogenic, very powerful, very beneficial drug. So it isn't cannabis. It isn't Advil. It isn't ciprofloxacin. All of which, by the way, we have reams of data surrounding, right? I mean, we have decades of data of a meaningful nature that is definable and searchable in many different slices and dices and ways. So it is profoundly different in spite of the fact that especially those in the cannabis industry that are desperate for more revenues will associate it with psychedelics and mushrooms in particular. It's not the same, and it shouldn't be treated the same. And I think the feds were pretty quick to say that directly and politely indirectly. Yeah, I mean, the FDA in concert with the DEA is those are the two primary drivers of the responses to the market, right? And the FDA, I heard someone say that if you left the federal government up to a solution for polio, the world would have the world's perfect iron lung, but we wouldn't have a solution for polio. We wouldn't have a vaccine. And I think the FDA is best suited for responding to market need by facilitating safe interventions and uses of psychedelics for these complex diseases, as opposed to leaning in and coming up with it themselves. They're not built for it. They're not designed for it. And I think, especially from the folks that we've heard from the FDA, they're in violent agreement with that that's not their job. Their job is to say, okay, you're telling me that you want to deschedule it. Let me respond. I'm not going to the market and saying we have to deschedule this. That's not the FDA's role, and certainly not the DEA's oversight and a role. I think that's more the role of the caregivers on the VA health system side, on the DoD MTF medical treatment facility side. They're care providers. The FDA is not a care provider. They're a care model responder, if that makes sense. And it's appropriate. I think that's best use. I think they're good at it. I think that, again, they rein in irrational exuberance that would otherwise cause us to open the floodgates in an unsafe manner, because we would desperately want to. Right. And I think they have not an antiseptic lens, but they certainly have a data-driven social benefit focus to how they're viewing the problem. And I think that's healthy as again, a countervalence to some of the desperation and exuberance. So that was my personal takeaway there.